Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Paul Garrow. I'm a Métis from Batoche, Saskatchewan, which is just north of Saskatoon, and I am an assistant professor, soon to become associate professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. So my role today, if everyone can see me and hear me, is that I will be the MC, the Master of Ceremonies, for this presentation of our brand new book honoring the Declaration, which is we're very proud of and very happy about. So the first thing I want to do before we all start is to do a land acknowledgement for where this takes place, where I am living in Edmonton, and where the book took place as a collective for its brief little time. So to acknowledge that we live and work and do all of our great things on Treaty 6 territory, which is the homelands of Cree, Nakota, Blackfoot, Dene, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe people, and also the homeland of the Métis. And to say this acknowledgement means that we respect the long-standing relations and traditions that Indigenous people have had and still have today in these amazing places that we live and work. So I'd like to say bonjour, everyone, and tanse kiowao. And I look forward to a really great interaction with all of our authors and our presenters today. So, and before I start before we go further down, is that I want to bring your attention to the University of Regina Press. Lohit has put a link for the book where you can buy it online. It's Turning the Tide bookstore, which is, you could click on it in you could find it in the chat, and you can go get the book, read it cover to cover 3 times, and you can let Dawn and me know how good it is or what you think. So, so thank you very much for everyone to be here, and we're very excited for presenting our work together and sharing with you everything. So, without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic, if we can, the Zoom mic, to our opening ritual with Becca Whitla and Darlene Sikat. Take it away.
Thank you. I just want to say how honored I am to be here. I have had the pleasure for the last 2 years of working with wonderful colleagues at St. Andrews, and they have a generous, collaborative, welcoming spirit. And so it's been a total delight to dive into the book and read their work. And I just also want to say what a pleasure it was to meet Darlene very briefly over the phone, and I look forward to further conversation with her. I'm going to begin just with a prayer, and it comes from my ancestral lines, in part from an Irish community that's dedicated to prayer and work for peace and reconciliation, Corrymeela. And the prayer that I begin with is called A Prayer for Reconciliation. Where there is separation, there is pain. And where there is pain, there is story. And where there is story, there is understanding and misunderstanding, listening and not listening. May we, separated peoples, estranged strangers, unfriended families, divided communities, turn toward each other and turn toward our stories with understanding and listening, with argument and acceptance, with challenge, change, and consolation. Because if God is to be found, God will be found in the space between. Amen.
Hi. Okay. I don't know if my face is going to go forward or just a backdrop voice. I will share my prayer, Cree prayer. No tawanan kisimantu, wichinan mina, ganawa minyan anuch ka kisigak, niyanan kitawasmak, napewak, napesak, iskwewak, iskwesak, ekwa kakiao, kutakak, asiniawak uta, askik, kita, tima, inan, hi hi. Basically, we're saying, our Creator, help us, protect us today, all day. We are your children, your boys and men and girls and women, and all others of all nations, all people here, all the world. We are thankful and thank you. And it's actually timely that we're having this book launch when it's recently announced that the Pope is going to come to Canada. And it's on reconciliation and relationships with Indigenous people. So we're already starting to find a process to find out where he's going to be, take some of our women there and see if we can be part of that process and witness it and be part of that healing and understanding and relationship. So I kind of wanted to bring that into our book launch today, and for our honoring our declaration book, what it can do for us today and what it can do for future generations and classrooms and relationships between clergy and their congregation, and even our governments that provide, the infrastructure around the country, and support them and hear that part of the country's words, that we're able to keep working on the reconciliation relationship. And timely for Saskatoon, this Reconciliation Saskatoon has started in 2016. And then Esquewek, we've been doing reconciliation relationships for 16 years in the city on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So I give blessings to the rest of our launch today and hope to see you all soon, face to face, safe from the pandemic, and everybody's healthy and well. So take care, and looking forward to the rest of the evening.
Hi. Thank you, Darlene. And thank you, Becca. That was really beautiful, and it puts us in a really good, it does things in a good way. It puts us in a good place to move forward together. So thank you so much. So now I'd like to pass the Zoom mic, as I say, to the U of R Press representatives. Elsa Johnson, the interim director for the U of R Press, University of Regina Press. Welcome, Elsa.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you, Becca and Darlene, for giving the opening prayer. As Paul has said, I'm Elsa, and I'm the interim director of the University of Regina Press. And we're so pleased to be able to be here today at the book launch of honoring the Declaration. I too would like to acknowledge the land that we work on at the press, and we're on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis people. And we acknowledge the importance of our treaty relationship to our existence here in work and in play, and in the press's mission to be a voice for many peoples. URP is really excited to publish honoring the Declaration, to be a part of today's celebration with what I am just finding out in my new role to be an amazing group, really, of scholars, writers, activists, and thinkers. And we're honored, really, to be a part of what is a meaningful response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. So thank you, Dawn and Paul, for your work in bringing this book to fruition. As I've seen you call yourselves, it's timekeepers in this deeply collaborative process. And I would also like to thank St. Andrew's College for the financial support that made this publication possible. Honoring the Declaration provides academic resources to help the United Church of Canada and other Canadian denominations enact their commitment to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and offers a framework for reconciliation. And the essays of all the people in this book really bring together a variety of perspectives and engage a multitude of issues. So I really look forward to listening to Don and Paul share more about the book and hearing the contributors tell us more about their chapters. And I would like to welcome everyone to participate in this discussion in the chat below. However, I do need to say that please bear in mind that we strive to facilitate the safest possible space for our authors and guests. Please show kindness and respect to everyone in attendance. And now, Paul and Don, I look forward to hearing from you about how this book came to be.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Elsa. So we will turn our attention to Don Schweitzer. So you will start us off and tell us about the grand story of how our conversation started and how we're still together doing this after so many years.
Well, let me begin. Can you hear me, Paul?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, let me begin on behalf of Paul and myself by thanking the University of Regina Press for accepting this book for publication and for doing such a fine job of getting it into print. The book had its beginning on March 30th, 2016, when 7 Canadian churches, United Church of Canada among them, announced that they had adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation between themselves and Indigenous peoples in compliance with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action number 48. At the time, I was reading a book called Blood and Ink by Robert LaSalle Klein, an account of the Jesuit martyrs of the University of Central America. In it, he wrote of how these Jesuits decided to dedicate their scholarship to the service of the people of El Salvador. Reading this in conjunction with receiving the announcement by some Canadian churches led me to wonder if the faculty of St. Andrew's College could do something similar. Adopting the Declaration as a framework for reconciliation is a far-reaching enterprise. It will require all the resources the churches can muster. Following the example of these Jesuits, could we as faculty dedicate our work to providing an academic resource to help our church and others fulfill this commitment? This idea was broached at a faculty meeting, and eventually a faculty agreed to it. A second key step occurred as we realized that reconciliation work is not something settlers can do on their own. We needed to invite Indigenous scholars to collaborate with us. We decided to hold a symposium to facilitate this. We received a grant from the United Church to provide funding and set out invitations to a variety of Indigenous scholars. On November 23rd and 24th, 2017, they and we gathered at St. Andrews to discuss what each of us proposed to contribute.
So yeah, so this is where I come in, I guess. I was talking with Christine Mitchell as like I am part of the executive of the Canadian Society for the Study of Religion, CSSR, and Christine Mitchell is CSBS, so the Biblical Studies section. And we're sitting at this table, and she points to me and she's like, "Hey, would you like to be, part of this discussion on UNDRIP, the Declaration, right?" And I was like, "Oh, I guess so. I don't know." I was just like, what is the Declaration about? What is this all about? So it really put me in a space where it's like, who am I as a Métis person to talk about the Declaration, and where do I fit in? And it really put me in this mindset to see how I would work within this framework, right? So essentially, it came to be that I was invited by Don and everyone at St. Andrews to come from Edmonton to Saskatoon, and I was very, very excited to be in Saskatoon. I grew up in Bellevue, Batoche area. Saskatoon is like the prairie of the Paris of the prairies, so it's a beautiful place to be. So I was very happy to come, but I was very skeptical about my role due to how I grew up as a as a Métis Catholic in a small French Canadian town of Bellevue near Batoche, right? So it's like, how do I fit within this framework of Indigenous rights? And my experiences and my community's experiences dealing and living through structural racism, living through like issues around dispossession, and all of these important key rights that Indigenous people experience, right? And I had no idea, and I had no idea really about United Church, anything. So I'm just like, here I come, like everyone was super welcoming. And I was very happy to come into this really great space because it was a very like engaged space together, right? And I was very, very touched and I was very inspired by how the United Church took reconciliation so seriously that they deployed or they turned to the Declaration, the United Declaration of Indigenous Peoples to frame their reconciliation activities and response. It's like, wow, the government of Canada just figured that out, sort of just lately. So I was very impressed, right? So it challenged it. So for me coming into this space, I set myself down as a Métis citizen in relations with other Indigenous peoples with me, and then all of the settlers, scholars who from St. Andrews, and we had this great conversation that lasted very intensely in 2 days, coming together. So from that really great conversation, we had me and Don became what we call timekeepers, because it's not as hard as editors. But then we ended up being editors here, so we couldn't put timekeepers into the book cover. So, but I think for us, we really wanted to have like a collaborative and relational sort of attitude around how we're not shaping the way the discussions are going. It's everyone's shaping our collective discussions about this from our own positionalities in our own place, right? And I think that works extremely well for Indigenous perspectives and epistemologies, right? So what we did then, everyone wrote their papers, and we each were paired off with other authors in the book to edit each other's work. And I was with Hiran, and I loved it. She is so incredibly smart and critical and engaged. And we just had a great conversation over that summer. And so I think because everyone had these conversations in relation to each other, it really deepened the separate discussions as an overall book. So as an overall manuscript, right? And since then, it's just been us, me and Don, working with the press, getting it forward and moving it forward. And I'm really proud and happy that we have this book today to share with everyone, right? On how Christianity can reflect on its own role in bringing together in taking reconciliation seriously. So I think and I think we were very very pleased when Michel Andros Andreas had said that this is a truly seminal work among the schools of theology in Canada. So I think that really cemented for us, yes, we did something very, very, very good, and we're very satisfied with it. So for this book serves as a testament to the importance of Indigenous sovereignty in all nation-to-nation relations, and that's really key. So Indigenous and settler, human and more than human, or other than human, as we nurture dynamic, consensual, and grounded acts of reconciliation. So I'm very happy and pleased that you are all here to enjoy this with us and to hear a bit from our authors as we move forward. So at this point here, we'll take 2 to 3 minutes to allow our authors, each of our authors, we have 10 chapters, to speak to their chapter, what they've done, their thinking about it, their process, and their experience, right? So we'll first, I will name off people one by one, and then they will come on camera and present and talk. So the first is Sakij Henderson with chapter 1, and that will be presented by our illustrious Don Schweitzer.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Sakij Henderson has been a research fellow with the Native Law Center here at the University of Saskatchewan since 1993. And unfortunately, he couldn't be with us this afternoon. His contribution to this book really began with his work as a strategist to create Indigenous diplomacy in the United Nations system, and then as part in the drafting team and working groups that framed the declaration and eventually got it adopted by the UN. His chapter in the book identifies reconciliation as the largest national project facing Canada in this century, and argues that seminaries like St. Andrews need to see the resurgence of Indigenous peoples as an emerging grand narrative of liberation. He identifies a framework of Indigenous imperatives deriving from Canadian law and the Declaration, and he offers directions as to how these might be implemented. Sackage also contributed to the book's introduction and co-wrote the afterword.
Thank you, Don. Yeah, Sackage was a very central person to working closely with Don in this work. Yeah, did you need to say something, Don?
I just wanted to say, I forgot to add, at the symposium where we all met together, Sackage basically functioned as an elder to the group, and had a very profound influence on us.
Yeah, someone with such a deep experience and like knowledge of the Declaration. He was really, really special to our collective. Thank you, Don. So now we'll turn to Christine Mitchell for chapter 2. Here she is.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here and so pleased to see so many people be here. So in my chapter, I ground myself as a Euro-Canadian settler, trying to show how biblical texts, because I'm a biblical scholar, how biblical texts dealing with invasion, colonization, exclusion, and genocide operate within Canadian social and political discourse. And I argue that while churches have one role to play in dismantling the biblical bases of the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, my guild of biblical scholars, both religious and secular, has just as important a role in informing Canadian public discourse. Some biblical texts give a roadmap for true reconciliation, which always consists of both repentance and reparation. And I suggest that this is a way forward in the Canadian context. So that's from my bio at the beginning of the book, and I'm going to read a short section from my chapter, towards the end of my chapter. So as a settler, what options do I have? One option is to turn to other biblical texts to look for models of reparation. One of my favorites is a text from Leviticus, which is directly concerned with something that's stolen, and I'm not going to read the text, but it's chapter 6, the first few verses. There's a series of broader principles at play in the logic of the text, applicable beyond the case of theft. First, it's a sin to deal deceitfully. Second, one has to feel guilty about the sin. Third, one has to pay reparation in excess of what was gained through deceit. And forgiveness can happen only after the recognition of guilt and the making of reparation. And when we apply this logic to the Canadian case, we can see that as a society, we have recognized that we have dealt deceitfully and we feel guilty. However, that's not enough to gain forgiveness or even reconciliation. We settlers need to make reparation. Without making right the wrong, right relationships will not happen. The text from Leviticus suggests it's for God to forgive, not the wronged party. So perhaps we should be holding up this text, and instead of insisting upon extracting forgiveness, as settler readers, we can be asking, what do we need to do? And perhaps one way forward is to actually heed the call of the TRC and to read the conquest texts through the lens of the UN Declaration with its affirmation of human rights for Indigenous peoples. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Christine. That was excellent. Next is Lynn Caldwell for chapter 3. Take it away.
Thanks, Paul. And I just have to say to start with, I'm just so engaged by, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I'm just so engaged by the talk of the project and the whole experience and how animated Paul and Don are about what we've been doing together. It's bringing me into that. And that's kind of what I want to talk about, but I'm going to stick to what I wrote about my chapter. I'll get carried away with celebrate, like just kind of talking about what we're participating in. So my chapter is chapter 3, and it's titled "Restructured Feelings: Pitfalls of Settler Christian Turns to Social Justice Education." And in it, what I'm writing about, or what I'm addressing, is what I read or interpret as a call to education as one part of a commitment, of the commitments made by churches through identifying the Declaration as a framework in the ways that this has happened. So I'm specifically addressing what I identified for the purposes of the exploration: settler Christian education for social justice. And in the chapter, I expand on and examine and talk about the importance of considering how any of those descriptors, so settler, education, social justice, how those are taken up. And I'm also writing about an audience assumed or identified in the letter from the churches and the letter to the church. So this is where the focus on settler Christian education for social justice comes in. So it's specific form of education and specific claims about education that I'm looking at. And I'm writing as someone who has engaged in the kind of education that I'm examining and critiquing. So really important to what I'm putting forth in the chapter is an argument for scrutinizing, and that's the term I use, or studying, having conversation about, examining what kinds of claims are made for education as a path to the forms of reconciliation that are at issue here. So I'm just going to read a short paragraph from my chapter that speaks to that. Education is not a self-evident, singular, or inherent good. After all, residential schools were part of what is called education. And there is much activism and scholarship contesting any assurance that education in its various forms is inevitably good. Education is a site and process that always involves power relations, uneven histories, and all the effects of institutions and culture. It's a social phenomenon. To invoke education as a path to justice or transformed relationships and identities must be to invite a conversation, and a conversation attentive to the debates about what education does. When we encourage education in the context of settler Indigenous relations, or specifically in response to a Canadian church's affirmation of the implementation of this declaration, the resulting conversations can benefit from recognizing at a bare minimum the existing knowledge and direction from settler colonial studies, Indigenous and anti-racism scholarship, and related activism. There's existing knowledge about the problems of taking education as a given, and also specifically about settler participation in anti-oppressive, reconciliatory, or anti-racist educational efforts. And so that's what I write about. I write about and respond to some of that existing knowledge, and particularly with reference to studies of anti-racist education. I draw on the work of Carol Schick and Verna St. Denis and Gada Maroos, particularly, as a lens through which to examine my own contention that we should take care in how we assess the impacts of what is done or what is considered as education. So thank you, and I'll turn the page or pass the mic.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lynn. So next in line is Adrian Jacobs for chapter 4. Welcome, Adrian. You're on.
Okay. My name is Adrian Jacobs. I'm the keeper of the circle at Sandy Soto Spiritual Center, but my clan name is Ganusano, and I'm of the Turtle Clan of the Cayuga Nation of Six Nations Haudenosaunee Confederacy in Southern Ontario. So I live as guest here in Treaty 1 territory on Anishinaabe traditional lands. And my chapter concerns the development of Indigenous, really the resistance development and the affirmation of identity and self-determination. And so when I summarize the history, my thoughts about it are the stories around the history, stories around that which I've written are far more interesting than the stories or the summary that I've given. But there is a long history of the unique needs in Indigenous communities, training programs, courts of the church being established. Our first Indigenous moderator, Stan McKay, was significant in our development. And so all of these various pieces of development were all efforts at self-determination. And I think that one story I could say is that maybe the spirit of what was in the UN Declaration and the calls to action of the TRC was the idea of, here we have the 4 colors of the United Church crest now, the Indigenous colors with the Mohawk words, all our relations. And in 2012, we were overlooked in the basis of union, and that was corrected by our history being included there. And one of our leaders said, "This looks very Indigenous, but when you open it up and look inside, it's all white." and I beg your indulgence in all of that. I simply have said, and I think that it's been the history of our efforts, is that when we open up our Indigenous manual, it needs to look Indigenous, because that's what the spirit of the UN Declaration is all about. And the policies need to be reflective of the Indigenous reality. And so I'm glad for the apologies of the United Church for its colonialism, and efforts to recognize that that was not the good way to go. And I'm thankful for the idea of following through with that. But our elders responded to the apologies by saying, we received them and we're glad to hear them, but we don't accept them because we don't know what that means yet in community. And so I just wanted to read the last bit of my chapter to explain what that vision for the future is. It was a significant thing for the UCC to apologize for colonization in 1986, and specifically for Indian residential schools in 1998. But the response was from the elders indicative of Indigenous concerns. During a 1984 General Council meeting in British Columbia, Elder Alberta Billy broke meeting protocol and called on the church to apologize to the Indigenous community for what it did. When church leaders finally did receive that answer, the answer or the apology, the answer was, we receive it, but we don't accept it. We need to see what this means. When these apologies are felt in remote fly-in communities, and the local church members can say what the UCC's apologies mean, then there will be acceptance of these words. Until then, an apology is an aspirational ideal without substance. And so that's the tenor of the chapter that I wrote. And we are well on our way to achieving that with the 9 calls to the church accepted in General Council 43. And Sandy Soto is in the middle of all of that work, especially thinking about the idea of Indigenous testamer that's centered in Indigenous communities, languages, and lands.
Thank you, Adrian. That was right on. So before we move on to Sandra, I want to remind everyone that if you have questions or comments or anything, nice questions and everything, to put them into the chat, and Lohit was going to gather them, and then we will bring them to the conversation, to the Zoom conversation at the end. Okay. So now, I'm pleased to present Sandra Beardshaw for chapter 5, for her chapter 5.
Thank you very much, Paul, and what a pleasure to be together as authors and with this wider community celebrating this book. Chapter 5 is titled "Not Alone in This Struggle for Justice: Project North and the United Church of Canada, 1975 to 87." The early 1970s saw an explosion of Indigenous activism in Canada. In the same era, Canadian church leaders were beginning the slow process of reckoning with the colonized paternalism of their relationships with Indigenous communities. They were also beginning to cooperate ecumenically in a wide array of social justice initiatives. One of these ventures was Project North, an ecumenical coalition of Canadian churches formed in 1975 to support the demands of Indigenous communities for justice across the Canadian North. I have worked both as an ordained United Church pastor and as a professor of church history and ecumenics. So I chose Project North to study as an early attempt at partnership between Indigenous leaders and settler-led Christian communities. My chapter outlines how Project North formed, what it did, the mixed reaction of United Church members to its strong and unrelenting demand that Canadian society recognize Indigenous rights, and then considers some lessons learned from that project. Well, this week, Kairos, the ecumenical organization that now carries on the mission of those 1970s coalitions, is marking its 20th anniversary with a series of gatherings online. Well, at the online gathering on Tuesday, Priscilla Solomon, who is an Ojibwe member of the Anishinaabe Nation and a sister of St. Joseph of Sault Ste. Marie, recounted the struggle for full Indigenous partnership in Kairos's life and work. So Kairos, this inheritor of these coalitions. She recalled a Kairos meeting in North Bay, Ontario in the mid-2000s, at which an Indigenous member finally gave up in frustration and said, "We don't want a campaign, we want a relationship." Well, that exclamation helped to transform Kairos's ethos, not a campaign, but a relationship. My hope in writing this chapter is to nudge us through memory and repentance and hope a little closer to that goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Beautiful. So I'm next. My name is Dr. Paul Garrow. I'm Métis from Batoche, as I said. I grew up in a little village near Batoche and Saint Laurent, St. Louis, Duck Lake. All these places are part of this Batoche homeland, and I grew up going to pilgrimage at Saint Laurent de Grandin, and it was just something that shaped me as a young man. Shaped me because of all the visiting and all the things that we've done. And I think this is where my work is right now and with this chapter. So my chapter is called Storied Places and Sacred Relations, Métis Density, Lifeways, and Indigenous Rights in the Declaration. So my chapter looks at the socio-religious elements of the Declaration as they relate to land and Indigenous sovereignty. It is necessary to hear the stories of Indigenous peoples in order to affirm the rights that are productive and meaningful. This work, therefore, focuses on understanding Métis experiences of religion at Catholic pilgrimage sites like Lac Saint Anne or Saint Laurent de Grandin, where I grew up. My role in this chapter and role in this work and being with you is to unpack Indigenous ways of understanding the sacred and relations, especially relations. We're talking about relations, right? Darlene talked about Francis finally coming, and talking about Adrian's part, that Indigenous people are about relations. And if that doesn't happen, get out, So for me, that's about relations with regards to the concepts of these concepts in Indigenous studies brought in by my boss, an amazing Métis scholar, Chris Anderson, about Indigenous density and lifeways, to see how Métis ways of knowing and being beyond the restrictions of settler colonialism, and settler colonial racialization, to affirm Métis nations' stories and connections to places like Lac Saint Anne as visiting places, right? And these visiting places that are in all over the prairies, right, all over the Métis homeland, are the things that are sacred because they sustain our nationhood and our peoplehood relations. So for me, the whole point of doing this work and being in this place was to see where the Métis fit within the Declaration and to take a place amongst other peoples, right? And I feel like I was very welcomed and happy to be part of this, and I'm very honored to have Darlene and Adrian and everyone here to be talking about relations as a key factor in the work that we're doing, right? And I wanted to say too, I never said it's the whole title of it. The book is called Honoring the Declaration, church commitments to reconciliation and the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. And it was Sakich who said, we kept calling it UNDRIP. Everyone started saying UNDRIP. And Sakich said, we have to call it the Declaration because it's something that we do together to make a statement to push back against possessiveness and dispossession, right? And to foster a relation. So thank you very much and hopefully you'll read my chapter and it won't be too dense. It'll bring you something important, some joy in your life. So merci everyone. And next in line I have here on my screen is Hiran Kim Craig for her chapter 7. Take it away.
Thank you, Paul. 안녕하세요. Saying hello in Korean, my first language. How wonderful it is to be with you all this evening. I was really privileged to be part of this project as St. Andrews College faculty member then, though now I am at Emmanuel College, Toronto. My chapter deals with the first part of the Article 12 of the UN Declaration, which says, Indigenous peoples have the right to manifest, practice, develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies. As practical theologian, I focused on the word practice, basically arguing for the importance of practices through rituals and ceremonies for Indigenous peoples and Christians. I first examined how Indigenous peoples' practices, especially dances and drumming during ceremonies, have been oppressed in order to assert Christian supremacy. I then demonstrated how Indigenous peoples have subverted and resisted this oppression, demonstrating a kind of playful resilience in translating Christian hymns into the Cree language. I suggest that one way to challenge Christian supremacy is to contest the narrowly defined Western dominant notion of knowledge, which heavily relies on literary and printed written work, while lifting up the embodied, oral, and performative knowledge as communal, relational, and corporate practice. Holding both aspects of knowledge as a way of knowing that epistemology requires hybrid practices that are in creative and sometimes critical tension. And these hybrid practices also shaped a hybrid identity among people who are both Indigenous and Christian. So in the final section, I reviewed the United Churches Canada's worship resource called Gathering to show how such hybrid practices have been evident in Christian worship by way of acknowledging Indigenous Christians and their practices. It is clear from that review that efforts have been made as both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in the United Church try to find a way forward toward creating Canada, a word that is in Cree language means sacred place. So I end my article pondering a reality that not only do Indigenous peoples have the right to manifest, practice, develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies, they also have wisdom to offer non-Indigenous settler Canadians and Christians concerning the sacredness of life and the importance of coexistence and reconciliation through celebrating and developing practices that are both Christian and Indigenous.
Thank you, Haran. So our next contestant would say is our dear friend Don Schweitzer for chapter 8.
Thank you.
Yep.
This chapter chapter 8 examines how justification by grace can be a spiritual resource for settler members of the United Church and other denominations as we reorder our lives and worldviews in light of the history of colonialism in Canada and the guidelines of the Declaration. It argues that justification enables us to come to terms with our guilt arising from this history. And the justification also provides a framework for the recognition of others and for honoring the ethical space in which Indigenous nations and Canadian governments should meet.
Short and sweet. Thank you, Don. So now we would like to invite Jennifer Jansen Ball for her chapter 9.
Great. Thank you. It's great to
Thanks,
be
Jen.
here with everybody. I'm a Christian social ethicist who situates myself in a liberative framework which takes very seriously the lived experiences of systems of oppression and marginalization. And so it's from that place that I wrote my chapter entitled The Declaration and the Common Good. And so in my chapter, I'm looking at ways in which the Declaration raises questions about the vision or the ethic of the common good as a kind of universal norm or applicable to all people. And in particular, I argue that universal norms like the common good have served to erase the needs and rights of particular groups and societies. And so I focus my critique of the common good on the lived realities of systemic oppression and marginalization that Indigenous peoples in the colonial state of Canada have experienced. And I argue that we actually need to hold together both universal and particular norms, and that the particular norms that arise out of those lived experiences need to inform and challenge and even correct the universal norms. And I think that the Declaration provides us an example of this kind of tension of holding together the universal and the particular. In the Declaration, universal human rights are understood to be applicable to all individuals. And at the same time, in the Declaration itself, these human rights are understood to be collective and contextual to Indigenous nations. And so I think the Declaration can help create a framework for a revised understanding of a common good that's both particular and universal, and that can attend more fully to the lived realities and experiences of injustice, and therefore help shape ways of living into a new reality, a common good or common goods that is particular, contextual, and applicable for all people. And then in my chapter, I also suggest some of the ways that the United Church's commitment to the Declaration as a framework for reconciliation can be a framework for creating a common good. And I also raise some questions about how the United Church, which has typically been one that's held universal norms that are applicable to all people, can live into its ongoing, strongly named desire really to be a liberative church, one that's attentive to the particular ways that individuals and groups are impacted by systems of oppression. And so I believe that a revised ethic of a common good can help the United Church as we continue this journey of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Jen. So our last but not least group is a collective work by Iskwewak, by Women Walking Together with Susan Gingell and Darlene Sikat. So welcome. The mic is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
You bet. Right on.
Yep, okay. Yeah, Iskwewak is Wichiwichitik is a concerned citizen group that we formed in Saskatoon in 2005. And our first event was on International Human Rights Day. So right off the hop, we did something that, was part of the international bodies and marker dates to do this work on awareness and remembrance and supports of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And since that time, we've had collective leadership and collective membership where people can come in and out. And we're not nonprofit. We don't have an office, and strictly, volunteer. And this is not the first kind of theological process we've been through as part of our awareness. It wasn't really a slow start, as I think as people start to really see the impact of the crisis of missing persons and missing Indigenous women, that some of the churches did invite us to speak, generally to their little smaller circles. And then they had a national women's church gathering where we were instrumental in, presenting to them and telling that congregation in that circle what we do and what we would like to do with them, with their circle. And that was spearheaded by late Marianne Assaley, who we dedicate this chapter to. And she was one of the national TRC members. So there was a period of time she was away from our group, working with the national TRC. So we were lucky to have her, have Helen, Smith McIntyre, another core group member, and Susan, our esteemed scholar and Smith word expert, and helping us guide our process. I think it's very, I know for the Indigenous community, they sometimes may question, where we steer off to for Iskwewick when we're doing this work on missing Indigenous women, because of the historical relationships between religion and, residential school and the churches. But it's still necessary to have those conversations, no matter how hard it is. Even for Indigenous people, we do have that conflict and struggle amongst each other. But we can't ignore that this is history, and for things to correct, we need to kind of keep doing this challenging work. And when we were part of the symposium, we had I think two 1-hour sessions, and I think that gave us the groundwork to how we could shape our chapter. And then we had previous experience doing a chapter for Kitsanek with Dr. Kim Anderson and Marie Campbell. They gave us more pages than most of the other participants because we were frontline grassroots. Then that was very nice, because the experience we've gone through with writing our pieces always has to have, the family's voice. And you'll see the story of Carol Wolf and her missing daughter, Karina. And I think it's important to remember that we're trying to use our Indigenous languages to guide the kind of writing that we do. And Wakotawin, when we're working together, and then Mayopi Matisiwin, these are words I grew up hearing, but they weren't just standalone words. They were part of a verbal action. And that's the way I was taught. And that's basically the teachings and the heart work that Iskwewick does to do this relationships with families, and then bringing it to wider audiences so they understand that it's not just in the head, it goes to the heart. And those Cree words kind of frame and guide the process constantly. And when we're not, we steer off from that, then we're vulnerable again. So I think leading the chapter that way just gives people kind of another blessing, another prayer to what they're going to read, and then kind of helps us affirm what it is what we're trying to convey in our response to the declaration. So I think Susan will be able to help us with the other parts of the chapter.
Thank you, Darlene. As a recovering academic, sufficiently seasoned to be retired from my work teaching decolonizing and transnational literatures. I've had the rich experience of working for a number of years now with and one offers what one can to a group like that, and writing is one of the things that I can do to help represent the group. But it's really important that our writing convey the heart-centered way in which we work. And we specifically wanted to replicate in our chapter our practice of creating occasions for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and gender diverse peoples, the families and friends, for them to be able to tell their stories to those who are willing to be witnesses to the suffering that they have experienced. Our chapter is called Working from the Heart, Considering Reconciliation, Minwastamatowin, through the lenses of Mio-Wakotowin, which Darlene says is good relationship, Mio-Bimatsowin, a good way of living, and gender. And our main title, Working from the Heart, is actually the expression of something that Helen Smith McIntyre, who's a member of the group and a United Church minister, said to us earlier on in our process about how the language of the Declaration is the language of international law, and therefore it's kind of head-centered. And so because we want to work from the heart, it was important to us to bring family story in. And we'd like for you to be able to see Carol Wolf and her daughter. So I'm hoping that her image can come up on the screen. Very important to us to tell Carol's story. She is a deaf person who communicates by sign language. I was supposed to give the cue analogously to bring up the picture. So there we go. Maybe Carol's face says enough for you to want to read her story in this book. She's courageous, she's determined, and she honors her daughter, Karina Beth Ann Wolf. Carol had the experience of ambiguous loss for 5.5 years. And that means that her daughter was gone from her life, but emotionally still very present. And then Karina was discovered murdered. So Carol's work has been to honor her daughter's memory and try to do what she can to address the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people. I don't think I have time to read you the little section I was hoping to, so I'll just invite you to read the story. Our article's subtitle is informed by the Native Women's Association of Canada advice to the TRC in a document called Culturally Relevant Gender-Based Models of Reconciliation. And that's what we're trying to bring to this collection. We honor the gender sensitive Indigenous diplomacy that brought the Declaration to fruition and the work that it then took to get the UN to adopt it, and belatedly nations like Canada to do so. At the same time, as activists on missing and murdered Indigenous women and gender diverse people, we also point out some of our concerns with that framework, which includes the fact that gender diverse people's rights are not included specifically in the Declaration, as well as some other issues, which I'll leave you to find out by reading our chapter. Thank you to Paul, to Dawn, to all the co-editors, and for your attention. Thank you. May you be well.
Hi, Marcy. That's a beautiful way to end this very brief discussion of a really excellent book. So thank you again, Nay. So at this point here, I want to remind everyone, if you still have questions or anything that you want to ask our participants, our authors, please put them in the chat or wait for at the end, we'll have a little Q&A. So at this point, I'm very honored to invite Michelle and Andreas and Allison Stevens who read the book and are going to talk about it. That's very excellent. There she is. She's got a copy. Good job. So I'm going to, we're going to start with Allison, and I'm going to read her bio, and then we'll move to Michelle, and I'll read your bio, okay? So Allison Stevenson is a Métis scholar and adoptee whose family is from Kinistino, Saskatchewan, raised in Pile of Bones, Regina. She joined the Indigenous Studies Department at the University of Saskatchewan as the Gabriel Dumas Chair of Métis Research in July 2020. Allison has published research on prairie Indigenous diplomacy, the history of decolonizing the care of Métis children in Saskatchewan, and Indigenous women's political organizing. So we thank you very much, Allison, for being here, and take it away.
Merci, Paul, and thank you, Lynn, for extending the invitation for me to comment on this very thoughtful new collection. Congratulations to editors Paul and Dawn, the authors, and to the U of R Press for putting together such an important contribution outlining the spiritual and intellectual significance of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for us. As a scholar, I feel like my own intellectual journey as a Métis historian trained in Canadian history was bookended by the issue of residential schools. As I first entered the U of S in 1996 as an undergraduate, I attended a talk by a professor who later became my MA supervisor, Jim Miller, on his forthcoming book, Shingwak's Vision. There I was first introduced to residential schools in Canada. Having grown up in Regina as a Roman Catholic, I'd never heard of residential schools or had grasped the deeply colonial relationship between the state and Indigenous peoples as an adoptee raised in a white family. I completed an MA, then a PhD in what was then known as Native Newcomer History. In 2015, the year when I completed my PhD in history on the 60 Scoop, was also the year that the TRC released its final report. Thus, my intellectual development as a Métis historian in Canada has been profoundly shaped by my growing understanding and engagement with Indigenous genocide, settler colonialism, and now reconciliation and Indigenous resurgence and sovereignties. This is only to say, I am now very pleased to see what I think is the next iteration in this necessary reckoning with the past, envisioning the future. But I'm not here to talk about myself, and I'm here to sing the praises of this mighty collection. In honoring the Declaration, readers have been gifted with a powerful spiritual and practical roadmap to actioning reconciliation. The authors have each contributed to exploring how Christian churches and Indigenous peoples can live out the promises inherent in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and co-create a future where relationships differ dramatically from the oppressive relations of the past. The richness of this collection is evident at the outset, as the editors explain the centrality of ethical engagement with Indigenous perspectives, authors, and diversities. In bringing together scholars of different backgrounds and career stages, community advocates with ministry leaders, readers are introduced to the deep engagement that each has invested in thinking about the promise of the Declaration in their respective endeavors, indeed offering us the opportunity to experience what is possible through such collaborations and dialogues. The editors and authors are to be commended for bringing this rich and significant collection to fruition. Each author has offered readers a unique and insightful perspective to the meaning of incorporating the Declaration for reconciliation. Chapters look at reconciling church practice, as well as the possibilities of revisioning new non-Indigenous identities that are grace-filled and spirit-led, joyfully committed to adopting the UN as a guiding framework for Indigenous self-determination. Missionaries and lay people were imbued with racial logics of colonialism and cultural and spiritual superiority, and engaged in acts of genocide against Indigenous people. Indeed, governments harnessed the evangelizing mission of the church to their imperialist and settler colonial expansion, land appropriation, and resource extraction. Indeed, these ideological frameworks continue to hold power over many mainstream Canadians today. Thus, the necessity of this book, produced by such able and thoughtful authors, to lead church members and educators into an alternative and radically new relationality based on Indigenous inherent dignity, humanity, and self-determination. This work involves engaging at the level of both the heart and the head, which is utterly essential for any meaningful engagement in this work of reconciliation. The achievement of the Declaration at the UN, and moreover its centrality in providing Canadians with a new relationship for reconciliation, is a culmination of decades-long spiritual movement. Indeed, in this book, Indigenous spiritualities form a central core. The history of Christian churches in Indigenous communities, apart from their roles in the residential school system, are complicated, deeply personal, in many cases continue to undergo reflection. Nevertheless, this work holds space for engaging with such complexity as our past, present, and future are brought into conversation. As Indigenous peoples, we have experienced the violence of dispossession, removals, spiritual colonization, and marginalization. Nevertheless, as Dr. Paul Garreau mentions, our lands retain our original sacred teachings, and other Indigenous people mention, which will continue to power our relationships into the future. The future orientation of reconciliation is premised on education, open-heartedness, and reckoning with the past. Indeed, it is also important that Iskweewak, we Witchiduchik, caution be front and center in the colonial present. Indigenous Two-Spirit women and children continue to experience gender-based violence, and thus recognize there is still far to go. 60 Scoop survivor Dr. Jacqueline Marie Maurice titled her PhD thesis, "Despiriting Aboriginal Children, Western Constructions and Destructions of Aboriginal Children in Child Welfare Systems in the 1970s and 80s. Government policies such as residential schools and 60 Scoop were experienced on all levels by Indigenous children and families, but especially that of the spiritual. I am encouraged by the work that has been done here in acknowledging the rules for churches such as the United Church and others in enacting reconciliation through adopting the UN Declaration, as has been identified by both the TRC and the world's Indigenous peoples. It calls for nothing less than a radical reordering of our settler colonial present, and this work forms a vital first step. So thank you, authors and editors and press.
Excellent. Thank you, Merci, Allison. Powerful. So now we pass the mic to Michelle Andreas, and I'll read your bio and then you can speak. So Michelle Andreas is the Dean of the Faculty of Theology at University Saint Paul, or Saint Paul University in Ottawa. Michelle's main areas of research include intercultural theology, theologies of interreligious dialogue, and religion and culture. The primary focus of his current research is reconciliation of the Church with Indigenous peoples of the Americas and dialogue with Indigenous spiritualities, with a particular emphasis on the Canadian context. And Michelle is also generously gave us a little word of happiness, which is very nice. So thank you very much, Michelle. Take it away.
Thank you, Paul, for this kind introduction. And I really mean what I wrote on the back of the book as part of my endorsement. I will say something about this in my comments. I've been honored twice, and first by being to review the manuscripts, which I was in a way surprised. I didn't know where the invitation came from, but I felt I was so excited to see the title and the whole format and the book, and I read the manuscript with a lot of interest and passion, because it nourished me in many ways and gave me a good example on thinking theologically from other denominational perspectives on moving forward with this commitment to the calls to action and to using the declaration as a framework for a new relationship. It really, I never thought of the declaration as a framework in the same clarity and seriousness before reading this book, and particularly the first chapter by Sake Henderson, and then how it's unpacked in a variety of perspectives and areas all throughout the book. Now, at that time, I was in the middle of editing a book that of a similar format, which is the Church and Indigenous Peoples in the Americas in between reconciliation and decolonization, which only appeared in 2019. And we had the similar two-day conference in Chicago, at the school where I was teaching before St. Paul, with a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous theologians from different parts of the Americas, which gave the format of this book. But the focus was more on the theological conversation. And I see, I will say a word about the difference between the two perspectives and the importance. Now, the interesting thing is one of the framing chapters in this book is by Marie Baptiste, who is the other half of Sake Henderson, and her work on decolonizing education was a leading lens to think about decolonizing theology, or thinking about. So anyway, the book for me, I have 3 comments that I will quickly make. The first one is the challenge to the schools of theology. I mean, this is not just one book and one school. It's modeling a response from a seminary and the School of Theology that other schools of theology, even though have an aspiration to follow, but there is, to my knowledge, there has been so far no work of that kind of systematic seriousness and responding to the declaration and the calls to action from one particular tradition. So in a way, it sets the bar high that it's really an inspirational work with such a depth, and bringing the elements from a particular tradition that also has been leading in the sense that among the first churches, the first church actually to present, to offer an apology and lead the way in that sense. And I see now also a seminary in the tradition of the United Church of Canada leading the way and presenting a first step and model to other seminaries to follow, who all of us, I feel like many of us aspire to do this kind of move, but not many or not have actually done or taken this step yet. So there is a huge institutional challenge. I feel our School of Theology in Ottawa is deeply impelled to respond to the declaration and calls to action. We are a school in the tradition of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. We know the impact of the Oblates on evangelizing, quote unquote, the Indigenous peoples of Canada in the 19th and 20th century. And a school of theology, Catholic School of Theology at the Canadian capital at this moment, at a Catholic university that has an ecclesial status. So all these combined factors put us in a position of responsibility morally as a school of theology to respond in a way. And honestly, it's very challenging to the agenda that's clearly set in the first chapter of the book by Sake Henderson is overwhelming to schools of theology. when we look at where we are now and what are the challenges, and we see our desire and interest and commitment to move forward, and where do we need to be at this moment, we haven't really made even the initial small steps. They are very modest and very how to say, preliminary, let's say, given the magnitude of the responsibility and the imperative that I personally fully share. The response so far is not up to the moment of so in a way, I feel that chapters in this book, and particularly its introduction, is a call to the seminaries and schools of theology in Canada. It really, it frames the book, but it also frames many books to come in a way, in terms of responses by other schools from their own context and their own tradition and their own histories. So I am delighted to, see this work come to publication. I feel deeply inspired by it. In this sense, I meant it's a seminal, that it's setting a tone for other schools of theology. Until now, we don't institutionally, we are way beyond the level of what is needed to respond. We don't have theologians who are trained in this kind of response. Our theologies continue to be profoundly Eurocentric and colonial, probably among the most colonial field in humanities. And the challenge to the challenge, as is clearly articulated in the introduction chapter, to ethically address the global shift in consciousness, which requires a cognitive shift that unravels the legacy of Eurocentric colonialism and racism, and requires a shift in Eurocentric religion, philosophy, humanity, and law to trans-systemic reconciliations. I think theology might be, in my opinion, one of the most entrenched disciplines in this kind of Eurocentric formation, because it emerged out of a profoundly Eurocentric Christian thinking and intertwined with colonization, and was formative of what happened in Canada. So the work in theology is deep and will take a long time. And I cannot really say that I am hopeful that in my lifetime I will see significant change, but the challenge for us is not only to our institutions to respond, but also to our discipline to decolonize itself and think in a new way, in a new intercultural decolonial ways, which could be, which require a profound transformation that is not there. We don't. If I look realistically at our situation as a discipline today, yes, at the last annual meeting of the Canadian Theological Society, the theme is there, and there are many people addressing the topic, but we are still a kind of dispersed attempts at thinking theologically in a systemic way to how do we reframe or rethink our theology through the new parameters of the declaration and the calls to action. It requires, it's an agenda for decades to come, requires collaboration between seminaries. I dream of an emerging conversation across seminaries and schools of theology in Canada. No school is going to be able to do this alone. And one thing is to describe how and talk about critically what one church is doing. Another way is to really rethink our theology in the future that could be truly an intercultural, respectful theology working within the framework of rights in the framework of the declaration. So this is a long way for us in theology, and I hope we can also do at one point a launch of the book at St. Paul and in other places where we can model this to other theologians. We don't have students, graduate students, who are working in these fields. I mean, unfortunately, many of our students are still choosing topic that leads them back again to a more and to get more embedded in Eurocentric thinking and still using European philosophies and frameworks as partners of conversation with theologies to think about the future, at the expense of neglecting the rich and profound and deep and transformative heritage that is here in Canada among the Indigenous peoples, as we over the last few years becoming more and more aware of. And there is no serious sustained conversation with Indigenous spiritualities that I am aware of in the schools of theology that promises to become truly transformative and to help us rethink theology. So thanks to the authors, and thank you all for this organizing the meeting and the book, and congratulations again. And I look forward to a collaboration with the group and with to bring more theologians to the table, that we can continue this work that's badly needed for transforming our churches. Hopefully, the recent apology by the Canadian bishops in the month of just only a few weeks ago in the end of September sets a new tone that we didn't really have in the Catholic context. There were individual apologies by groups and religious groups, but not an actual apology, and the new tone and new humility, new brokenness, new openness that promises opening a new horizon. And the recent statement by the Vatican about the Pope's visit and the receiving of the Indigenous leaders in December in Rome, hopefully will also help put in motion some resources. We really need more resources. It's not enough to have good intentions, and there is I mean there is a lot. It's a big chantier that we need, and we're barely starting. But this book is certainly a good inspiration and will help us inspire us along the way. Thank you all.
Thank you, Michel. An equally powerful message to come together and have these discussions, to shift the discourse, right? And to do this in relations. I really love it. Thank you very much. And we're again honored that you and Allison presented and read this work and took it seriously and find it applicable, so I think that's a really important message there that we could take away and be proud of. So Marcy, hi again. So at this point, it is we are almost at the top of the hour, whatever hour that is across Canada. So we have now a moment for us to have questions and comments from the audience. We have a 15-minute allocated to this, 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have a closing comments from me and Dawn, and then we will probably shut the live stream, and then the recording, not the live stream, but the recording, and then share a conversation together. So if anyone has any questions or comments for the panelists or for Michel or Allison or anyone, you can raise your hands using the little icon under the ellipsis at the bottom of your screen. You can under the reactions, you can raise your hand there, or you can just turn on your screen and wave at me, and then I'll do it, or email us in the thing. So I'll start first then with a message from Sean, or a question from Sean, and this is to I think it's for Christine. I don't know if she's still around. So if it's a question for someone, one of our authors, if you can come on down, as they say in The Price is Right. Come on up and you can answer this. So Sean asks, there she is, she's in the dark there. What other HB, so that must be Hebrew, texts are on your horizon for application to this discussion? What are some common challenges, if any, you find in the application of these passages to this important work of reconciliation? Or are there any barriers in our own field that make the applications challenging?
Thanks. That's an interesting question. I think what I was trying to do in the chapter, and one of the things that I have learned from Indigenous folks in my own reading and work is that I want to not apply particular passages, and I don't think I really want to do that. Instead, I think what we see, or I think what is most useful, is using biblical texts to think with. So if we think with these stories, then it opens up new ways for us to think generally. And so thinking with biblical texts is a way to get us thinking about other situations that we find ourselves in this instance, in the work of truth and reconciliation and the UN Declaration.
Right on. Thank you very much. So are there any other questions? Nancy, did you have a question? You came on. If you do, turn on your mic.
I don't have a question, but I just want to say I'm a settler and I live in Nepean, which is part of the amalgamated city of Ottawa, and I'm involved with a right relations group here, and one of the people in our group gave me this a video link. So I just want to say I'm enjoying what I've been hearing tonight, and I will pass it on. I know she recorded it. I'm going to see if I can pass it on to our group, the recording, so they can listen to it, the people that aren't on this tonight.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for coming on. Any other comments or questions? We had a comment from the YouTube, from Kat Daywalker on YouTube. She says, "Thank you all for your scholarship and activism." That's right on. Good. So any other comments or questions, you can jump on the site now or put up your hand. And if you wait too long, I'm going to start singing some funny old Canadian songs. That's for Dawn. So further to Nancy's comment, this is from AC to everyone. How will this recording be made available more broadly? Bring on the songs. I think if Lohit could come on and let us know, it's available on YouTube. And maybe he could put it in the chat, but it will be readily available either on YouTube, through the U of R Press, if they have a YouTube account or something, but we will put it on one of the accounts, or St. Andrews if they have an account. I know the Faculty of Native Studies has one, so there's Dawn. I don't know if Dawn can respond to this question.
Well, Nestor's got his hand up.
Oh, Nestor's got a hand up? Okay, yeah. Go, Nestor. You can turn on your video.
All right. Thank you for giving me permission to do that.
Sorry, Nestor.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's all yours.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you all for your presentations. This promises to be a great book of engagement, or for engagement. I am curious, and I'm hoping that one of the presenters can speak to that in terms of colonization was mentioned a couple of times. I am curious about how this project, in terms of the declaration and the engagement of it in this book, contributes to broadening up the discussions on the implications for the reality for other racialized and minoritized peoples and their experiences also of colonization. In the context of Canada, a lot of us, including me, experience colonization in multiple ways. And so I'm hoping that some of you can also see this broadening up. I think Susan was the one who said the LGBTQAI voices were not added in this declaration, or missing in the declaration for sure. And not to kind of not to ignore that. I'm just curious if anyone there could speak to that broader reality of colonization and all of the other racialized peoples' experiences.
Thank you, Nestor. Does anyone want to respond to this excellent question about racialization and the declaration? Yeah, go ahead, Michelle. Turn on your mic.
I will respond briefly from my perspective. I am also an immigrant and someone who comes to this conversation not because that's not a hobby. It's not just because I didn't have other topics to work on from theology, but as a racialized person, as an Arab American, Middle Eastern Christian who experienced also forced migration, colonization, dispossession of land and culture and language and spirituality, etc., in connecting with this conversation and the resurgence of indigenous peoples and the dialogue of spirituality, it's a liberating praxis for me. It's not just, I'm not doing a service or I'm not just in solidarity with, it's really empowering and transformative. So in this sense, I see one people's decolonization is decolonization of others who are joining. So very briefly, I can say a lot more about this, but just wanted to throw this in the mix as a racialized person and working from a theological perspective, where this decolonization is central to my spirituality and the experience of empowerment that's coming from this kind of work.
Thank you, Michelle. Lynn?
Yeah, I just wanted to add thanks for the question too, and the importance of, I think, any project like this being something that opens up really contested terms and conversations and relationships. And I think, and it's a pitfall that in my own work, and one that I named too, about sometimes when we talk, particularly in context of colonialism and Canadian churches, of kind of situating church as white and settler in ways that, in problematic ways that don't take up the experiences of racialization in churches, and how colonialism is that we need to open up the conversations in ways that that take in open up the conversations. I'm just going to end that there. I'm so conscious that I just want to talk more with everybody, but I just wanted to thank for that question, and to say that it is that it's a pitfall that I struggle with too.
Right on. Thanks, Lynn. Susan?
Thanks. I just would like to respond by saying that reconciliation needs to happen across multiple sets of community and cultural relations, and respect for a variety of people's spiritualities, truly honoring those spiritualities and seeking to learn about them, I think is part of the larger project of reconciliation that must follow in the wake of the imperial project and the colonial project. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. And thank you again, Nestor, for a powerful and engaging question around like how do we engage BIPOC like voices in this really important place. So thank you very much. I'm going to read some comments here, and then I think we might wrap it up if no one has a burning question. If you have a burning question, make sure you put it out there. So comment. Oh, Darlene Sikot's got a burning question here. Go. Oh, your mic. Turn on your mic. Yeah. There you go.
It's not so much a burning question. It's just a reminder
Yep.
Of the National Inquiry to Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Throughout the journey of creating our book, and while we were doing our chapter, we were on a speed train. Isquewick is part of that experience of attending expert hearings, of submitting documents, of going to the launch, going to the final report. I think with the TRC still being the focus, that the calls for justice are still in the margins of that conversation. And I don't know if it's mentioned in our chapter, but I think we can't forget that the churches was a reflection in that process. I know the United Church, they responded. Reverend Richard Bott and Reverend Maggie Dieter, executive ministers, Indigenous Ministries and Justice, urged non-Indigenous United Church people and friends to read the final report and support the calls for justice. These calls for justice represent important ways to transform systemic and societal values that have worked to maintain colonial violence. So I just wanted people to, not so much forget about the TRC, because it's just come up so much since the graves have been discovered, that the calls for justice in the National Action Plan on Violence Against Indigenous Women and Girls is our lead right now, but we're still finding that we're in that margin of conversation. So if this book will help those conversations and the gender reconciliation pieces that we put into our chapter, that people are mindful of the journey that we're still working on, that we're trying to transform our cities and our country and our provinces on moving forward.
Thank you, Darlene. A very excellent point. Thank you. So just I think for the last little minutes here, we'll just bring up some comments, and there's a question too, which we might not get to, but Bill Richards says, thank you to all the colleagues at St. Andrews for the important work that they have done on extending the declaration in their own fields. And thank you to their own other colleague contributions for this reflection as well. And then I have another comment here. Congratulations on all this great work. And then I have a question from Grosvenor United. Question to all. So if anyone wants to respond to this in a soundbite, I guess. How were you specifically challenged and changed by your engagement in this project? Dawn, you're on camera. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, first of all, there was an encounter with new ideas. I brought to the symposium Charles Taylor's notion of shared identity space, and Sackage responded with Willie Ermine's notion of shared ethical space. And as settlers and Indigenous peoples, we inhabit both. And Ermine's notion of shared ethical space between nations, where Indigenous and Canadian governments meet, Indigenous peoples and Canadian governments meet, is an extremely important counterpart to Taylor's notion of shared identity space. So that was one transformation, encountering that and still wrapping my head around it and thinking through it. The second was a more personal transformation, which I find I'm always a stranger to myself. So it's a little hard, to say how I was transformed. But it was on a personal level, a transformative experience, and a different kind of encounter and a deeper kind of encounter with Indigenous people as we tried to do this work together. Working closely with you and and the other Indigenous contributors. It's hard to say, but it was. I'm in a different space now than I was 5 years ago when we started. I meant well back then. I still do, but I have a very different sense of who I am and how I should be operating. So we'll leave it there.
Thank you, Don. I feel like I can always banter with Don for some reason. Hi, Ran. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you for that great question. I would say that the challenge was how much it is lost, and I believe in the reconciliation as long as we know the past and that we are going where, right? But in terms of reviewing the kind of past materials, it was hard to reckon with the fact that, we'll never know. So that challenged me. And it's always challenging, right? As a scholar, digging into the materials and how partial, how limited our notion of knowing, right? So that's one. But then I was really changed by our experiences together. I still vividly remember our circle at St. Andrews. What is the call now? I forgot, lounge. And then we cried and we laughed and we ate, we prayed. And that is very experiential, kind of deep encounter. And I think that is a way to really move forward. So even if we are all scattered in different places, but knowing particular, very intentional gathering for the sake of this journey together will never be forgotten, in my own view. And I think more of those gatherings and relationship building as scholars, as activists, as teachers and learners will be something that I think we should all do more, even despite the pandemic. So that's one. The other issue is about a real sense of imagination, because when I was reading some of our Indigenous elders from the United Church, even in one of the funerals, eulogy and sermons, and I almost felt I was listening. I wish I almost sensed that elder was speaking to me, kind of feeling. And so knowing the challenge of not, the loss, that we will never retrieve everything, yet we cultivate our imagination to tap into our resources and being able to hear and see shaping the future together. I think that I would be ever grateful for this project.
Thank you, Haran. I think that's a good place to end our conversation overall. So thank you everyone for being here and participating. For about an hour and a half now we've been talking, which is really great. And I would like to just give the floor to Dawn for closing comments. And then we will wrap it up, meaning that the room will have to close and we won't be able to have a conversation after because the live stream will shut off. So this is just an opportunity for us to close the circle and send our thank yous. Okay, Dawn?
Well, thanks. First of all, heartfelt thanks to you, Paul. It was tremendous working with you. And a big thanks to all the contributors for their hard work and dedication. It's been 5 years, and here we are. And finally, again, thanks to the University of Regina Press for seeing the promise in the manuscript we sent them and seeing the book into print. Seneca wrote that in his chapter that reconciliation is the largest national project facing Canada this century, and it's certainly a huge task facing the United Church and other denominations. The word reconciliation has become contested, but whatever term we use to describe what has to happen, the task remains immense. And we hope that this book will make some contribution to this huge work that lies before us.
Thank you, Don. So I'm the last one. I was texting on the side, so yes, thank you everyone for participating in this conversation and putting your heart into the writing of this book and bringing things together. And I want to, like, again, at the end of all this, affirm at all times that the Declaration is about sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, and the things that Indigenous communities do matters, and engagement with religious organizations or settler ideas or all these things. It's all about self-determination. There's a lot of power there. So when Indigenous people are given the stage and centered and uplifted by settlers, it works the best for everybody, right? That's the heart of a territorial acknowledgement, of the heart of reconciliation. So merci and hi again to everyone who's put their work and sweat into this. And 5 years, oh my goodness, it's unbelievable. So thank you, Don, for being such a hilarious and wonderful person to work with, and leading us down this way too, like being a good timekeeper. So with that, I must say goodbye to everyone. Again, thank you to the U of R Press for all that you've done. The help on the background, fantastic. Thank you to all of our amazing authors who are here on the screen, which is really good. And thank you to our great readers, Allison and Michelle. You really helped us make this. Everyone made this a real success. So merci. You could put a little reaction heart, or if you want. Huh? Okay, have a good night, everyone.